Good day, ma'am. I am Arnel A. Pellegrino and I am here to discuss about the law on obligation and contract. And in this topic, we'll learn about the different elements and classifications of obligations and contract. So let's start. So a person desiring to engage in a business in a tourism, travel, and hospitality industry will meet certain obligation. So not just in tourism, travel, and hospitality industry, but all industry. When we are starting a business, we will face certain obligations in accordance to the business. So in Article 1156 says that obligation is a juridical necessity to give, to do, or not to do. So it is necessary to give, to do, or not to do. So there are four definite elements of obligations. Without these, no obligations can exist. So these are the following. These are the four elements of obligations. An active subject, also known as obligee or creditor. Second is the passive subject, also known as the debitor. Third is the object or the prestation. And the last one is the juridical or legal tie. So, obligation in a passive subject has two classifications. First classification is obligation to give a determinate thing. So, under this, it says that to deliver the thing has which he has obligated himself to give. Second is to take care of the things with the proper diligence of a good father of a family. Third is to deliver all its accessories and accessions. Fourth is to pay damages in case of breach of obligations. And the second classification is the obligation to do. So under this, it says that if the debitor fails to do what he is obligated to do, it will be done at his expenses. Also, it says that if the work is done in a contraventions of the tenor of the obligations, it will be redone at the debitor's expenses. And the third is if the work is poorly done, it will be redone at the debtor's expenses. So that are the following obligation of a passive subject. In Article 1157, obligations arise from law, contracts, quasi-contracts, act or omissions punishable by law, and quasi-delicts. So, there are only two sources of obligations, namely law and contract, because obligation arising from quasi-contract crimes and quasi-delicts are really imposed by the law. So, a contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some services. And a quasi-contract refers to a lawful, voluntary, and unilateral act based of the maxim that no one shall unjustly enrich himself at the expense of other. The two common forms of quasi-contracts are the first is the solutio indebite, which is payment by mistake, and the second one is the negotiorum gestio, which takes place when a person without the consent of the owner assume the management of an abandoned business. Civil obligations arising from criminal offense are governed by the provision of the revised penal code. Restitution, reparation of the damages caused, indemnifications of consequential the damages. By the provision of the civil code on damages, moral exemplary and nominal damages. Quasi-delicts, also called as culpa aquiliana, is any act or omission which causes damages to another, there being fault or negligence and there being no pre-existing contractual relation. These are the classification of obligation. The primary classification of obligations under the Civil Code are pure unconditional obligation, obligation with a period, alternative and facultative obligation, joint and solidary obligation, divisible and indivisible obligation, and obligation with a penal clause. And the secondary classification of obligation under the Civil Code, first is the unilateral and bilateral obligation. Second is the real and personal obligation, civil and natural obligation, legal, conventional, and penal obligation. So in Article 1231, obligations are distinguished by payment or performance, by the loss of the thing due, by the condonation of remissions of the debt. Obligations are distinguished by the confusion or merger of the rights of the creditor and debtor, by the compensations and by novation. In Article 1305, contract is a meeting of minds between two persons whereby one binds himself with respect to the other to give something or to render some services. So, these are the essential elements of contracts. Consent, which is manifested by the meeting of the minds of the offer and the acceptance upon thing and the cause which are to constitute the contract. The offer must be certain and the acceptance is absolute. Second is the object certain, which is the subject matter of the contract, and cause of the obligation, which is established. So, there are a lot of characteristic of contracts. The first characteristic of contracts is mutuality of contract. So it says that its validity and performance cannot be left to the will of only one of the parties. Second is the autonomy of contracts. Parties are free to stipulate terms and provision in contract as long as these terms are provisions. Third is the relativity of contracts. Contracts are binding only upon the parties and their successors. In interest exceptions, stipulations in favor of third persons, stipulations pour autrui, as in a beneficiary of an insurance policy. Fourth is the consensuality of contracts. Contracts are perfect by mere consent, and no form is prescribed by law for their validity. Exceptions: real contracts such as pledge and chattel, mortgage contract covered under the statute of frauds. Five is the obligatory force of contracts. By the obligatory force of contract, it constitutes the law as between the parties who are compelled to perform under the threat of being sued in the courts of law. According to the relation to the other contracts, preparatory or those which have for their object the establishment of a condition in a law which is necessary as a preliminary step towards the celebrations of another subsequent contract. Example of these are the partnership, agency, common carrier, and insurance. Second is the principal, or those which can subsist independently from other contracts, and whose purpose can be fulfilled by themselves. Examples are the sale, lease, common carrier, and insurance. Accessory, or those which can exist only as a consequence of or in relation with another prior contract. Example is the pledge or the mortgage. Second classification of contract is the according to their perfection. consensual, or those which are perfected by the same mere agreement of the parties. Example of this is the sale and lease. So, second is the real, or those which required not only the consent of the parties for their perfections, but also the delivery of the object by one party to another. Example is the comodatum, deposit, pledge. Third classification of contract is the according to their form. So, common or informal. Those which require no particular form. Example is loan. So, loan are no particular form. Second is the special or formal, or those which require some particular form. Example is the donation, chattel or mortgage. The fourth classification of contract is the according to their purpose. So, transfer of ownership. Example is sale, conveyance of use. Example of this is the comodatum. Third is the reddition of services. Example is the agency, lease of service, and labor. This is the fifth classification of contracts. According to their subject matter, like things. Example is sales, deposit, or pledge. Services. Example is the agency, lease of services, and labor. And the sixth classification of contract is the according to the nature of the column which they produce, like unilateral, or those which give rise to an obligation for only one of the parties. Example of this is the comodatum and the gratuitous deposit. Bilateral, or those which give rise to reciprocal obligation for both parties. Example of this is the sale and lease. So, the seventh classification of contract is the according to their cause. Uniros, or those in which each of the parties aspires to procure for himself a benefit through the giving of an equivalent or compensation. Example of this is the sale and insurance. Also the common carrier. Gratuitous, or those in which one of the parties propose to give to the other a benefit without any equivalent or compensation. Example is the comodatum. And the eighth classification of contract is the according to the risk involved. So, commutative, or those where each of the parties acquires equivalent of his prestations, and such equivalent is pecuniarily appreciable and already determined from the moment of the celebrations of the contract. Example is the lease. So, aleatory, or those where each of the parties has to his account the acquisitions of an equivalent of his prestation, but such equivalent, although pecuniarily appreciable, is not yet determined at the moment of the celebration of the contracts, since it depends upon the happening of an uncertain event, those charging the parties with the rest of loss or gain. Example is insurance. And the last classification of contract is the according to their names or norms regulating them. So, example is this, nominate, or those which have their own individuality and are regulated by special provision of law. Example is sale, lease, common carrier, insurance, deposit, and agency. And the innominate, or those which lack individuality and are not regulated by special provision of law. In the Roman law, the innominate contracts were classified in 4 groups. Duot des means I give and you give. Duot facias, it says that I give and you do. Faciot facias, it says that I do and you do. And the last is the faciot des, that means I do and you do. And that's all. Thank you.